So good morning. So all of you changed, your clocks changed, you woke up and you're saying, boy, I wish I could have had that hour back now. It's amazing how much 1 hour can make a difference in your patterns.
But we're going to love it this afternoon.
Yeah, you like it better this afternoon when you have a little more light in the day, at least as far as your watch shows. No actual change, but as far as your watch shows, it'll look a little different. So, while we're, hopefully second shift will come in probably around, what, 10:15? 20 after 10, something like that.
Which shift you talking about?
Yeah, when they realize their clocks are all off and everything. But you are here, and we're going to get started in our study of the book of Ruth, and should be a very good study, interesting in a lot of ways as we look through this little book. Now, as we think about the book of Ruth, one commentator noted of this book that it has been called the most beautiful short story ever written. And that's interesting to have that type of statement made about this little book. And of course the book gets its name from one of the three main characters that are listed in the book: Naomi, Boaz, and then Ruth, who was the Moabite daughter of Elimelech and Naomi. And Boaz, of course, is a relative of the deceased husband of Naomi, Elimelech. Chapter 2, verse 1 brings this out. Now, there are several points just about Ruth, and what we're doing is introduction here, just introductory type things about the book and the background of it and so forth. One, they do not know the original origin or the precise meaning of the word Ruth. And I thought that was very interesting when I ran across it. I'd never really thought about it that much. But one commentator notes that the word Ruth could be translated and meaning friendship. And another commentator notes that it could be called a female friend. That's what her name actually means, but it's really kind of uncertain. And another commentator even noted that her name may have come from a word which meant refreshment, or satiation, S-A-T-I-A-T-I-O-N, ever how you pronounce that. But, just interesting that a little simple word, Ruth, we would think, should have a simple meaning. Well, not necessarily. It was just one of those words in that time that people used, and she was called that, but exactly what it meant is open to several variations. And Ruth wasn't an Israelite. She was a converted Moabite. And this book is the only Old Testament book that is named after a non-Israelite. All the rest of the books of the Old Testament were named after Jews, Israelites, except the book of Ruth. Who was the only New Testament writer that wasn't a part of the Jewish group? Just to kind of throw it in and see. There was one New Testament writer that wasn't a Jew. Luke. Who only wrote a gospel and the history of the New Testament, but he was not a Jew. So Ruth is the only non-Jewish book of the Bible, titled book of the Bible, and Luke is in the New Testament the only non-Jewish writer of the New Testament. And Ruth has the least to say. It's interesting that the book is named Ruth, but she has the least to say of all the main characters in the book. One commentator, and I didn't include it here, talked about all of the words that are listed in the little book. Ruth, percentage-wise, has the least dialogue. It really could have been called the book of Naomi, because Naomi is the primary character in the book as far as dialogue and what's going on and so forth. Or it can be called the book of Boaz, because Boaz has even more to say than Ruth in the book. And because it's a book that talks about the lineage of David, it could be called the book of Obed, which is the grandfather of David. So, but it's called Ruth. And it's interesting also that the book has never been seriously challenged as an inspired work. From the very beginning, when this book was written, there was never a question of its validity, of its being given by God. Early on, it was connected to the books of Samuel before it was separated into its own individual book when the Hebrew was translated into the Greek back in the what is called the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, translation from Hebrew to Greek, which was done around 285 BC. Some commentators will say between 3 and 200 BC, but I have also heard 285. And during the reign of Ptolemy in Egypt. Now, to give us a little background into the book, because this sets the stage, it defines the movement of the book. The events recorded in Ruth occurred as it stated in verse 1 of chapter 1, New International Version, in the days when the judges ruled. And this would, of course, been the period of time between the death of Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy with Saul, also during the lifetime of Samuel the prophet. And this is about as close as we can get to the time frame of the events that are recorded here. Sometime within that time frame of after they had conquered the land of Canaan, at least to the extent that they had conquered it, the death of Joshua, and the ascension of Saul as the first king, sometime in that period, probably before Samuel really came on the scene. We might could narrow it down to that, but that's about as far as we could go, and not really sure exactly what that time frame might have been. And this was a time that was filled with chaos, the time of the judges, with spiritual leaders that arose in various areas from various tribes of Israel that brought deliverance and revival in the worship of Jehovah. However, none of these judges, none of these leaders were able to unite the whole land as much as they were under the reign, or leadership rather, not reign, but the leadership of Joshua. Most writers, including Jewish as well as Christians, have said that Samuel is the most probable author of this little book. However, there are some modern writers that will try to place the writing during the reign of David or even after the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. However, most commentators, most writers, most people who look at language and so forth still hold being that Samuel is the author of Ruth. So this brings us to the point of why was Ruth written? What was and is the message or messages of this little wonderful book? And what is it that we're going to be seeing as we go through this account of Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth? Commentators note that for such a short little book, 4 chapters, there are many differing purposes offered for the book. Some people, some commentators, will say the book is just simply historical, showing the lineage of David. And it does do that. Others note that the book was written to show how God is totally and continuously in control of all human events, even though unseen. And that's true. Because the book is about one family, it was written to show God's providential involvement in the lives of individuals. And that's true too. A lot of different angles to the book of Ruth. And some of the things that we're going to be looking at as we go through this little book and talk about it over the next, ever how long we talk about it, is the providence of God, His hand in the causes and actions that take place in this world and in people's lives. And along with the idea of the providence of God, His sovereignty in the affairs of people. We're also going to be looking at the covenant relationship that bound the nation and the people to God and to each other. That's something we're going to be looking at. The idea of redemption is going to be discussed in this book, because we have a kinsman redeemer and how that speaks to us in our day. We will also look at the theme of the choice of God to use the most unlikely people to impact his plan in the world. That's one of the big things that stand out in the book of Ruth, that he used her to impact his plans in the world. One of the most unlikely people to do this. Probably the only other one that would be even more unlikely would have been Rahab the harlot. She might have been the only more unlikely person to have been an impacting person in the plans of God in the world. Ruth would have been a close second to that. Also, we'll see the introduction of Bethlehem, linking a nowhere town. Bethlehem was a backwater to Jerusalem, a nowhere town. But linking this nowhere town to the King of Israel and to the King of creation. That's one of the things that I think is a purpose in the writing of Ruth. And I think there's also, with all of the above that I've talked about, there's a message for the experiences that we as a people go through in life. And this is probably where we're going to focus most of our discussion and looking. We're going to look at all these other things, but they're all going to be wrapped in with this point. Because what we are going to see as we go through the book of Ruth is a life picture. A life picture that happened to Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon and Chilion, Ruth, Orpah, Boaz, right on down the line. We're going to see pictures from their lives that relate to the things that you and I are going through this very day. And as such, these pictures are given to teach us, to encourage us, and to direct our response to the situations that we find ourselves in, sometimes that are not of our own choosing. So, questions or comments? I know all this is just basic introduction stuff. Okay. Here's our little outline that we're going to follow. Pictures from a family's life experience. That's what that says. Just believe it. Chapter 1, verse 1 through 22. Essentially, chapter 1. We're going to look at providential opportunities in and from God's hand in chapter 2. We're going to look at the creation of a crisis decision. Chapter 3, verse 1, through chapter 4, verse 13. Probably the largest section of verses anyway. And then the ultimate plan is revealed. That's the fourth area that we're going to be looking at from chapter 4, verse 14 through 22, and that just simply talks about David's lineage, which is the ultimate plan message out of the book of Ruth. But all of these things come into play as we go through this little book. So it's going to be interesting. I have spent a number of hours the last week or two looking at this little book and beginning the process of laying out our lessons and our discussions. So this is where we're going to be going. So let's just pick up and take off with our first section. Now, Ruth opens with giving us a glimpse into a series of unfortunate events that struck the family of Elimelech and Naomi. And these events are made all the more interesting in that they happen to a family who worshiped Jehovah God and lived in the land that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had promised to them as well as to other families. And in these opening verses 1 through 6, we're going to start off with verses 1 through 6. In these opening verses, we see some pictures that are reflected in the lives of many of God's people to this very day. So let's look at this one. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife named Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, the other named Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. So there are several things that I want us to look at as we think about the basic situation of Naomi as the lead character, but her husband, Elimelech, and their 2 boys. And let's look at it. Pictures from a family. So here's a family that was in a chaotic situation. They lived in the days of the judges. And they were living in, which meant, as we look back and we look at the history of Judges, and we're going to refer to a couple of passages there, that they were caught, really. Not only lived, but they were caught in a very chaotic, confused, and a dangerous time. The time of the Judges, which the book of Judges describes, was a period of time that happened because Israel failed to conquer all of the land that they were given, and then failed as a people, as a nation, to follow the Lord who had brought them to the land. And as a result of their inability to stay united and dedicated to the purpose, various tribes and regions of Israel came under assault for their spiritual backsliding. I want to refer you to Judges chapter 1. We're going to look at some verses there. Judges chapter 1, really through chapter 2, verses 10 and 15. I'm not going to read all those, but those are the passages that really talk about what happened and how they did not conquer the land and how they failed the Lord. And it was that circumstance that produced a chaotic, dangerous, and confused time. The book of Judges ends with one of the statements that, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And when you live in that type of time, you are living in a chaotic, dangerous, and confused world. And the deliverance that is described to us in the book of Judges came from various and local and regional judges or governors that the Lord raised up to call Israel back to God. But this only lasted a short time. Judges chapter 2, verses 16 through 23. If you'll look at that passage. The book talks about this. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. I'm reading from the New International Version. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's command. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods, serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua.
Billy, were they forbid to marry? Were they not, they weren't supposed to marry into the Moabite, right?
They were forbidden to intermarry with the nations that were around them, which would have included Moab. Moab wasn't especially listed with that group, but the command was, don't marry people on the outside because they're all heathen, you know. So yeah, they were really forbidden to marry people on the outside, which would have included Moab. And there is a caveat to that, because it's in Deuteronomy, it does talk about that if a Moabite is converted or proselyted into becoming a Jew, they still couldn't enter the congregation of the Lord in the tabernacle and eventually the temple until the 10th generation. Which is interesting in that the genealogy of David is the 10th generation from Ruth. Which, had he been the 9th, David couldn't have entered into the tabernacle. He couldn't have even come near the temple or the ark of the Lord because of that Moabite heritage that he had. So, good question, good point with that. And as the Lord delivered, as he talks about in Judges chapter 2, there were at least 14 judges that were raised up that the Lord used. In the book of Judges, you can read it of at least 14. But now here's the message for this. Here's the insight for us. That is a picture of our day. Naomi, Elimelech, that whole crowd, they lived in a chaotic situation. And the loss of spiritual foundation, especially in leadership, opens the door to an infection and a decay that will place everyone at risk of facing chaos, confusion, and danger. That's one of the first things that we can see as we think about that little statement in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. They lived in the days when the judges ruled. There was a loss of spiritual foundation. And what caused this loss? We read it in Judges chapter 2. And let me give you a specific verse on this. Chapter 2, verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, this was Joshua's generation, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. That is the seed that destroyed the nation and created the circumstance of living in the days when the judges ruled, meaning a time of chaos, confusion, and danger. And when I say you, in big you, big picture you. And let me phrase it this way. Whether as a nation, or whether as a church, or whether as a family, we, either by neglect or hypocrisy of life, fail to instill the Word of God into the coming generation without clear parameters to follow, that next generation is going to follow their own idols. That is one of the strong messages that comes out of that first verse of Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled. What were those days? They were not fun. They might have been good for 10 years. Some of the judges ruled for 40 years. But it was only a short period of time. And then the chaos and the confusion and the danger would rise again, even from another area, because that judge only ruled a small area of the land. But when you lose your spiritual foundation, and I think, this is something that we can look at for our world, our nation. If we lose, and it looks like we are, for whatever number of reasons, and I'm not talking about political parties here, but I'm talking about us in general, when we lose the spiritual foundation for who we are supposed to be, the door is opened for anything and everything to take its place. And something else comes out of this. And I know I'm prodding you right now. I know it's going to come out in just a minute. I know it is. But when you have organized groups fail, and when I say organized groups, in Ruth's case, in Naomi's, it was the leaders of Israel, it was the 12 tribes, it was the leadership of that land that failed to do what they needed to do, lost their spiritual foundation. And when you have a failure of organized groups to address enemies, obstacles, and or challenges, it places the whole, good, bad, guilty, or innocent, into a position of suffering. Because it was in the days of the judges, there was a famine in the land. Now, the Lord had told Moses, and he had recorded it in Deuteronomy chapter 28, or really probably about 26, 28, 29, right on that whole chapter. There's blessings and curses in there. But it was national blessings and curses of what would happen if they failed to follow the Lord. And when you have an organized group that fails to do that, they open up everybody, whether they're even a part of leadership or not, to suffer the consequences of that. To our knowledge, Elimelech and Naomi, Mahlon, Chilion was just an ordinary family from a nowhere town. Nothing special about this crowd. But because the leadership of the country refused to step up, they had to pay the price. And this is true of nations, communities, churches, Sunday school classes, families. No one person acting alone is able to turn a group unless the group is willing to act with that one. Each individual judge brought some semblance of order and following of God, but the people only followed it for the judge because he brought them deliverance. They never really bought into it. And it seems that Elimelech, whose name means "my God is king," that's what Elimelech's name means. And he's the only man in the Old Testament that's given this name. This is the only Elimelech you'll find. You'll find Abimelech and Ahimelech, but you won't find another Elimelech. And all those leks, they probably all, kind of like Poindexters, You'll run into them all place, all colors, all shapes and sizes, probably the same kennel, just a different set of dogs, what I'm saying? But Elimelech, this is the only man in the whole Old Testament that is recorded that had this name, and his name meant, "My God is king." And it seems that he was trying in some fashion to lead his family, but the environment that he lived in was stacked against him because the organized group failed to be the spiritual leaders they needed to be based upon the law of God. So, what do you think about all that I've said so far?
Sounds familiar.
It does, doesn't it? Sounds familiar. We have pictures from a family's life experiences that this was 3,000 years ago or longer. It's as fresh as today's newspaper. Just as real. And when we think of, and we can think globally, and we can start blaming political parties and people and so forth, and there's a lot of fault out there, a lot of fingers to be pointed at. I ain't dismissing that at all. But let's bring it on down. Let's bring it down to our community. Bring it down to our church. Bring it down to our class. Bring it down to our families and our lives. When we fail to provide the leadership that we are providentially, opportunistically, I never heard of that word before, but I just created that, I'll try to patent that or, copyright it. Maybe I can make some money off of it. But whenever we're placed in a situation that God gives us leadership, we have a responsibility to help guide whatever group that is, ever how small that group is, or ever how large that group is. We have a responsibility to provide leadership based upon Scripture, because if we do not, there will be leadership provided, but it will be provided from the pagan world. Now, thoughts, questions? Because I've got some here. Ideas. I know you're thinking, I can feel it up here.
Well, first thing you think about is you want to blame the Muslims, but you can't blame them. I mean, they're doing what they're supposed to do. We're just letting it happen.
They're being very consistent with how they're founded.
And you know, we need to be pointing the finger at ourselves.
Yeah, because one person, we look for this, and we can take it and go to that political route. We're looking for one person in 2016 to turn this thing around. Really?
If that were able to happen, though, I mean, I don't get all political because I really think they're all crooks, one way or the other. But say that guy comes, or lady, or whoever it is that gets elected, and they can't turn it around. You have any idea how rough that's going to be on everybody to turn that around in an 8-year period?
Yeah.
It didn't happen overnight. You can't fix it overnight.
Can't fix it overnight. And whenever you have that loss of spiritual leadership, whether it's in a country, and it's easy to look out there, but put it down into a church, put it down into our lives. When we have a loss of leadership, it creates the condition for confusion, danger, maybe not physical danger, although I do know of a fellow down in South Carolina that tried to kill his pastor, had him in his rifle sights over the carpet in the fellowship hall. Spiritual, I'm talking spiritual stuff here, So it could be dangerous in that way. But certainly danger spiritually, danger emotionally, danger mentally, confusion, chaos. If we don't, and I say we, I'm not talking you, I'm saying we. If we do not maintain a good spiritual foundation for our lives. But now, let's look at this, because we're looking at these first 6 verses. And in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. And this brings a question to us. What are we supposed to do? What does the individual or the family do in light of national or more local situational failure? What are we supposed to do? Let's look at it from Elimelech's standpoint. He's a Jew living in Judah, in a backwater town, Bethlehem. And there's a famine in the land. And this just crazy chaos everywhere in the country. What am I supposed to do? How do I handle this? How do I step up? What is it that I need to do?
I have a technical question on that.
Okay.
When we were saying, or but biblical, when we were saying that you weren't supposed to marry a Moabite or whatever, was that one of those rules from the Bible, or was that God's law? We were saying you're not supposed to marry from, like the Jew wasn't supposed to marry the...
Well, I'm hanging up on God's law or rules from the Bible.
Like
they should be the same.
They had Pharisees, they had these rules,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
there was what God really wanted you to do.
That's what I was thinking, but I just
But you
wanted to
mentioned about
get the
rules,
clarification on it.
Because the reason why, if that was God's law, why was it okay that they married, and whose rule was it? Was it God's law that you couldn't intermarry?
No, it was God's law. He told them specifically that they were not to intermarry with the nations that are around. He said that several times throughout the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Even Abraham, when he was seeking a son for Isaac, he told his servant, don't get any of these women around him. You go to my family, and you find a cousin somewhere. And, that's a whole different discussion when we're talking about, we're not going out of state with this, to whatever state comes to your mind with that. But yeah, it was a command that they should not do this because of the inherent paganism that was there. The fact that not that they were second-class citizens or they were all deformed or something, but they were all sinners. They were not God's people. And the Lord did not want his people, and this is a particular Old Testament thing now, because he was preserving the line of Messiah. So he didn't want it all polluted. Ruth and Rahab are the only 2 non-Jewish people that can be connected to the line of Messiah in the Bible.
But why was it okay? Because it was...
Oh, he wasn't.
But I mean, I guess I'm saying is, why was it okay that he chose Ruth and now Ruth turns out to be David's grandmother? It's because it was Ruth and they were such good people. And why was it okay that their sons did it?
It wasn't okay. And we're going to talk about that. It wasn't.
Was not okay.
It was not okay. And that's the thing. When we think about what does a family do? What do we do? Was it okay for Elimelech to leave Judah? I mean, Judah was God's country. Quite literally. That was God's country. That was the place where the tabernacle was in Israel and the various tribes where he moved around for a number of years. That was where God's name was. This was God's place. These should be God's people. And you, Elimelech, are leaving?
Last week we had we were somewhere else, and the service was partially about Ruth. And the person speaking came back around and said, nobody told them to leave. That they were not even supposed to leave.
Yeah.
And I had never thought about that.
Yeah. And these are some of the questions that come up that we wrestle with when we are faced living in a world like we are living in a society that we are living in. Some of the questions, why should we leave a place where God is named for a place where he's not even acknowledged? Moab. They worship Chemosh. Chemosh was one of the gods where he held his brass arms out and they laid their kids in those arms and they were cooked in sacrifice. That was the land to which they were going. They weren't going to, well, we're leaving the Baptist church, we're going to go to the Methodist. No, it was a little bit different than that, So, the history of Moab, and let me give you a little bit of this history of Moab. The origins of Moab were contemptible. You remember the origin of Moab? Moab was the son of Lot's sexual relationship with his daughter. Unbeknownst to him, at least that's the way it's recorded, she got herself pregnant by her daddy, Ammon and Moab. Those 2 areas were the illegitimate children born of incest. Moab would not allow Israel to cross their land as they came into Canaan. Numbers chapter 22 through 24. Moab, it was the Moabite women that became the instruments of Israel's sin. Balaam suggested to Barak, who was a king in Moab, how to get Israel to fail. And it was the Moabitess women that became the instruments. Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 9. And I've alluded to this. Moab was excluded from the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 6. Moab was even one of the early attackers on the nation of Israel during the time of Judges. Judges chapter 3, verses 15 through 30. Elimelech, why are you going there? I mean, you got a famine here, but why are you going there?
Like us moving to the Middle East.
Yeah. It's like us moving to Iran
Right.
or finding ISIS and saying, can I live over here? There's a beautiful piece of property I'd like to buy. Why are you going to go there? And some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves as we face the dilemmas that we face as believers in this world, when we think about what am I going to do? How am I going to handle this? Some of the same questions need to be asked to ourselves, just update them, if you will. Why are you leaving a place where God is named for a place that He's not even acknowledged? I ain't going to that stupid church no more. Good grief, I'll just go out here. I know some friends down here at the convenience store. They're just, really? Really?
I mean, but if the family was so bad that, okay, I'm gonna stay here
Mhm.
and starve.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's
I'm
the
gonna go somewhere
dilemma.
else and see what
That's,
happens.
that's the quandary that we face. That's what makes it so real as we think about these guys. It's a famine. I can't feed my family. I can't feed my herds. I can't feed my flocks. I can't raise any money. I can go to Moab. I can go to Moab. Well, really? Should you? You got to answer that question. Should you leave a place where God is named to go where He's not? Another question that comes up. What are the others of faith doing? It looks like Elimelech was the only one who chose to leave Bethlehem and go to Moab. It's not recorded. If there was any others that decided to do that, it's not recorded. So he seemed to be the only one, at least of his family, that decided to go to Moab. Why are you acting so different from other folks of faith? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves a lot as we face the quandaries of life. What are the other people that we know are close to God doing? How are they handling similar situations? And why is it that I'm deciding to do something different? That's a self-question. That's a self-examination question. It's not a judgment question. It's a self-examination question. Because it is a quandary. We live in a quandary world. We look at all that's happening in our nation and around, and we're wondering, what am I going to do about this? But these are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves to help us as we figure our way through this time of the judges. Chaotic, confused, dangerous.
But back then, I've never looked at it like this, but he was probably, they were punished for doing that, because when we look at it now, we just say, oh, Ruth did this, but that was a big deal back then, that the dad died and the two brothers died. That was virtually destroying their family line.
Yeah.
And we don't really see that part, and I really never looked at that part of the story. So he was punished, and probably they were punished. But the thing is that Ruth then turns out to be such a big part of the story.
Yeah.
Not, you know, this thing, Ruth is big because he leads to David. So did God know what they were going to do and let them do it and let them do it anyway? And then he used Ruth. How did she become okay to marry, and then she turns out to be such a big thing in the Bible?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. I've asked that very same question of this, and we are going to look at that because that's where that element of God's providence and God's working, in which makes Ruth, among several books of the Bible, but Ruth especially, as we're looking at it now, makes it so interesting to see how God uses things that we should not do for our benefit. Now think about that. Things that we should not do, God can use for not only our, but in case of David, the whole country benefit. And we're going to talk about that now, because that's one of the things that as we look at Ruth, it's easy to read such a beautiful little book and read it and enjoy reading it. I mean, there's portions of this book, we'll see it in chapter 1, that's used in marriage ceremonies. You know, where Ruth says, you know, don't tell me to leave you, I'm going to stay with you till I die, da, 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 da. And that looks like all happy. That's really a depressed passage of Scripture. And we're going to talk about that, but Naomi is trying as hard as she can to get Ruth to go back home. Wait a minute. Naomi, you're telling somebody to go back to their heathen gods? You're telling somebody to go back? Why are you doing
Can you
this?
imagine where Naomi was? I mean, really and truly, when you think about, I think about the verse, you know, God works all things for good.
Mhm.
And she's lost her husband.
Mhm.
She's lost her 2 sons. Realistically, she has absolutely no way
Yeah.
to support herself.
Right.
Much less
Yeah.
daughter-in-law.
Mhm.
So she's at that point where just go.
Yeah.
You know, I would imagine in my mind a very helpless, depressed.
Sure. And she's a believer. Let's put it out there. She's a Christian. Chapter 1, really, we'll talk about it, probably get into it maybe next week. Verse 7 through 22 really talks about a wounded believer. That's an interesting discussion of being a wounded believer. That's what Naomi was. She was wounded. And you hear her, you read what she says, you see wound sticking out everywhere.
Which you could say for our nation.
Yeah. Say for our nation, say for us as individuals. And you know, we're going to dig into this because the pictures here lives today for our lives. And I'm going to wrap this up in just a little bit. But some of the other questions. Why are we moving? Why did Elimelech, are you moving? Are you running away or are you regrouping to fight again? Why are you taking the tack that you're taking in your situation this morning? Why are you leaving a place where God is named? Why are we acting differently from others who we know are close to God? What is our objective in how we are reacting? Are we running away or are we regrouping? Sometimes to retreat is a way of regrouping to attack again, and that's a good thing. But just to run away, why are you doing that? What is the benefit of your action? Elimelech is going to Moab. Well, I'm going to try to feed my family. What's the benefit of that action? You're going to die, your boys are going to die. How'd that work out for you, Elimelech? What is the benefit that our action is bringing us? Will it be beneficial to us spiritually? There's a lot of times we make our decisions to do or not do something based upon what it looks like on the outside, never thinking about the spiritual impact. And it's easy, and that spiritual impact may not come for some time later. But when it comes, it's going to be a spiritual impact you can't just shake or cover up simply because, well, it was good then. I thought I was, you know, it was really looked really great. What is the spiritual impact? And where are we inside? Where was we don't know where Elimelech was. As far as we know, he was acting as clearly as he knew how to do. And he was really trying to do the right thing. But it didn't turn out too well. And I think a lesson for us. And you say, well, that leaves me thinking, I've got to make up my mind. I've got to really think about this. Yeah, that's my point. To a lot of situations in our lives, there isn't an easy answer. Wish to God it was. That'd be just easy answers. Bump, bump, bump. Okay, that's taken care of. No, a lot of what we run into has no easy answer. But here are the questions. And there's others we could tackle on through that, but at least those 5 are questions we need to ask ourselves as we look at how we're going to survive and make it in a confused, chaotic, and dangerous world. I don't know if you anticipated this type of discussion coming out of Ruth or not, but this is what you're going to get. You know, it's going to get good. It really is. This is a wonderful study. It's going to get good. Thank you. I've got to let you go before they come up here and cut my salary again.